The selector drags the needle across the acetate so slowly that the whole yard holds its breath. It is 1957, maybe 1958. The years blur in memory, the way sweat blurs ink. And somewhere deep in downtown Kingston, Sir Coxsone's Downbeat is playing against Duke Reid's Trojan in a sound clash that feels less like entertainment and less like sport and more like a war conducted by people who have decided not to use guns tonight. Kerosene lamps throw orange light across hundreds of bodies packed into an open yard in the suffocating heat. The bass from the competing speakers does not merely travel through the air, it finds the chest cavity and lives there. Men lean forward, women tilt their heads, nobody is neutral. Clement Dodd is not a tall man. He is not physically imposing in any traditional Jamaican yard sense. What he is in 1957 is the most dangerous listener in Kingston, and in a world where the power belongs entirely to whoever controls what the people hear, that makes him the most dangerous man in the room. His sound system, the Downbeat, is fed by something none of the other big selectors in Kingston fully understood at the time. Coxsone traveled. He had been going to the United States, to New York, to Chicago, to New Orleans, since the early 1950s, working in the sugarcane fields of Florida under seasonal labor programs and using whatever money he kept back to haunt record shops in American cities. He came home not with souvenirs, but with weapons. He brought back acetate pressings of American rhythm and blues records that nobody else in Jamaica had, and he played them on his Downbeat speakers at a volume that made the ground vibrate, and the crowds that followed Duke Reid or Tom Wong's Great Sebastian came and heard something they could not unhear, and then came back again. He was born on January 26, 1932, in Kingston, Jamaica. His father, Lascelles Dodd, ran a rum bar on Orange Street, the nerve center of Kingston commerce, music, gossip, and the slow drip of social aspiration. And Clement grew up in the specific texture of that world, the clinking of glasses, the transistor radios tuned to American broadcasts when reception allowed, the way men gathered around music, the way birds gather around water. He was a cane farmer's son, who learned early that whoever held the record held the crowd, and whoever held the crowd held everything. The nickname came from cricket, of all places. The story has been told a dozen ways. Some say he resembled a Yorkshire player called Coxsone. Others say it was Coxsone. Others say it was simply a sound he liked. But what the nickname carried was a kind of authority, a gravity, and Clement Dodd understood that names were part of the architecture of power. He was Coxsone from the early 1950s onward, and in sound system culture you were your name before you were your face. The big three of original Kingston sound systems, Sir Coxsone's Downbeat, Duke Reid's Trojan, and Tom the Great Sebastian Wong's operation, were not simply music businesses. They were the infrastructure of an entire culture that had no other infrastructure to speak of. Radio was limited. Live concerts were few. Record shops were importing product that had nothing to do with Jamaica's working-class neighborhoods. The sound systems were the distribution network, the entertainment industry, the social institution, and the money machine all at once. And at the center of each system was the selector, the man who controlled what was heard. And behind the selector was the owner, who controlled which records the selector had to play. Coxsone's relationship with American R&B gave Downbeat an edge in the early years. He was playing Jimmy McCracklin, Champion Jack Dupree, Fats Domino, and early Chuck Berry pressings that his competitors simply did not have. When a record traveled across the Atlantic, arrived in a Kingston yard, and the crowd went silent with recognition of a sound they had never heard, that was Coxsone's genius at work. He scratched the labels off his best acetates so that rival selectors who attended his dances could not identify the artists and press their own copies. It was a paranoid, brilliant, small act that revealed everything about how he understood the music business. Control the source, control the sound, control the crowd. He also brought home something else from his American travels, an understanding of how recording studios worked, what a properly produced record could sound like, and the realization that Jamaica had no real domestic music industry of its own. Everything Jamaicans heard was either American, British, or Trinidadian. The island's musicians were talented and abundant, and entirely unrecorded. For a man who understood the power of exclusive sound, this was not a gap in the market. It was a blueprint. The first recordings Coxsone made were done under primitive conditions. In the late 1950s, he recorded local artists onto acetate for exclusive use on his own sound system, not for commercial sale, but for sound clash advantage. If the Downbeat was playing a shuffling R&B track that the crowd loved, and Duke Reid's Trojan tried to counter it, Coxsone could drop a locally made version of the same groove, featuring a Kingston vocalist whose face the crowd might recognize, and the energy in the room doubled. These early sessions established the working method he would refine into something legendary. Find the talent, record the talent, own the result, use the result. By 1963, he had taken the step that would define the next 4 decades of Jamaican music history. He opened Studio One at 13 Brentford Road in Kingston. It was not a glamorous operation. The early mixing desk was second-hand, the acoustic treatment was minimal, and the monitoring system was far from what any international engineer would have recognized as professional. But Coxsone had something that compensated for every technical limitation. He had the ear, he had the session players, and he had an instinct for sound that functioned like a sixth sense. The men he assembled as his house band became the most important group in the history of Jamaican music. The Skatalites. Don Drummond on trombone, Tommy McCook on saxophone, Roland Alfonso on tenor saxophone, Jackie Mittoo on piano and organ, and a rotating cast of players who defined the sound of ska, were not simply good musicians, they were the engine of an entire genre. Under the Studio One roof, they played with an accuracy and feeling that no assembled recording session in Jamaica had previously achieved. Don Drummond, who suffered from schizophrenia and whose life would end in tragedy, confined to a mental institution after killing his girlfriend in 1965, in a case that devastated everyone who knew him, was considered by musicians who heard him play in those sessions to be the finest trombonist who ever lived. The Skatalites played for Coxsone for session fees that were minimal by any standard, but they played every day, and what they created was singular. Jackie Mittoo deserves particular attention. The Canadian-born Jamaican who served as Studio One's musical director and principal arranger was, in formal musical terms, the most sophisticated musician in the building. He could score, arrange, and play in multiple styles simultaneously, and what he gave to the Studio One sound was structure, a harmonic intelligence beneath the groove that kept the music from collapsing into pure rhythm. The rhythms that Mittoo wrote and recorded at Brentford Road became the foundational vocabulary of Jamaican music for decades. Real rock, full up, heavenless, conqueror. These instrumental tracks were recorded once by Jackie Mittoo and the Skatalites, and then reused hundreds of times over the following decades by artists who layered new vocals over the original backing. The concept of the rhythm, a single instrumental track that serves as the raw material for multiple songs, did not begin at Studio One, but it was industrialized there, and it was Jackie Mittoo who made it an art form. There is something worth noting about a particular figure who arrived at Brentford Road in the early years, a wiry, intensely verbal young man from 9 Mile, St. Anne, who had come to Kingston with his friends Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston to make music and make something of themselves. He was 19 years old when he first approached Coxsone, and what he brought was not polish, but urgency. Something about the way he talked about the music, and about what the music should do in the world, was different from anything else Coxsone was hearing. There was a street-level moral seriousness to it that Coxsone recognized, even if he could not have articulated it in those terms. He put the young group in the studio, but there was also someone else in the building during those first sessions, a man doing odd jobs, fetching and carrying, writing press releases, scouting talent, trying to insert himself into the fabric of the operation. His name was Rainford Hugh Perry, and he went by Lee Perry, and even at this stage of his life When he was doing low-level work for the most powerful producer in Kingston, there was something in him that would not be contained. He had come from Hanover Parish in western Jamaica, from poverty, from the kind of hunger that sharpens a man's senses and clarifies his ambitions. He was funny, magnetic, slightly unstable in a way that could be exciting or alarming, depending on the day. What was certain was that he was paying very close attention to everything that happened inside Studio One. Who got paid what, which records were pressed for sale and which were shelved, how the books were kept, whether the artists who created the music ever saw a fair share of what it earned. He filed these observations carefully. Something about those years at Brentford Road clearly stayed with him in ways that would only become visible later, in a chain of events that neither he nor Coxsone ever fully explained. In January 1964, Simmer Down was released. It was recorded by the Wailers, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Livingston, and several additional vocalists, and it instructed the rude boys of Kingston to cool their aggression, to step back from the violence that was spreading through the city's neighborhoods. It went to number 1 on the Jamaican charts immediately, and stayed there for 2 months. This was not just a hit record, it was a cultural event. The music that Studio One was producing was not merely entertainment, it was talking back to the streets, and the streets were listening. Marley reportedly received $20 for the recording session. The account varies. Some who were present say it was less, some say there was a promise of more to come. What is not disputed is that Simmer Down made money for Coxsone, and that the young man who sang it did not see significant financial reward. This dynamic artistry, producing wealth at the top of the structure, while labor received a fixed payment with no royalty attachment, was not invented by Coxsone. It was the international music industry standard of the era, applied with particular ruthlessness in a Jamaican context where artists had no legal infrastructure to challenge it, no union, no legal representation, and no leverage. But knowing it was standard did not make it less true. The mid-1960s were the peak years of Skasta, and Studio One was the factory. The sessions at Brentford Road produced hits at a volume that no other operation in the Caribbean could match. Coxsone had a specific quality that made him almost impossible to outcompete. He could hear the difference between a song that was nearly right and one that was exactly right, and he had the patience to run the band through a track until it was the second thing. He paid his session musicians poorly. There is testimony from multiple sources that the Skatalites received 5 shillings per session, which in the mid-1960s was a nominal amount even in Jamaican terms, but he gave them consistent work, and in Kingston in 1965, consistent work in a studio was a rare thing. The catalog he built in those years reads like an inventory of everything that made ska the first truly Jamaican popular music form. Delroy Wilson, Ken Booth, the Heptones, the Wailers, Alton Ellis, Toots Hibbert, Joe Higgs, Lynn Tate, every voice that mattered in Jamaican music in the mid-1960s came through 13 Brentford Road and left a piece of themselves on magnetic tape that Coxsone owned. By 1966, ska had begun to slow down. The tempo dropped. The rhythm shifted weight from the offbeat horn stab to a heavier, more languid guitar pattern. Rocksteady was arriving, and with it came a different emotional register. Less jubilant, more melancholic, more explicitly concerned with love, heartbreak, and the particular loneliness of urban Jamaican life. Coxsone adapted. He always adapted. The Skatalites were breaking up. Don Drummond's incarceration had taken the trombone voice out of the room, and several other members were moving on. But Coxsone rebuilt the house band around the new sound with the same methodical efficiency he brought to every structural problem. The Wailers' relationship with Studio One ended around 1966. The accounts differ on the precise trigger. Bob Marley would say later, in various interviews, that the payment was simply inadequate, that the group had produced something of significant commercial value and seen none of it. Peter Tosh's accounts were more aggressive and more specific in their accusations. Bunny Livingston spoke less often about the mechanics of the split and more about what it represented, the recognition that the terms Coxsone offered were not terms any serious artist could accept long-term. What all three agreed on was that they left, and that the departure was not amicable. Coxsone, for his part, rarely spoke about the Wailers' departure in terms that gave away anything he did not choose to give away. Somewhere in the course of that same period, Lee Perry and Coxsone reached a conclusion of their own. Perry had been at Brentford Road for years by this point, writing releases, scouting talent, occasionally producing sessions of his own under Coxsone's umbrella. He had recorded his own songs for Studio One. He had helped build the infrastructure of the operation. He had watched everything. When he left, he did not leave quietly. He went home and wrote music about it. He recorded a track in 1968 called People Funny Boy, a song built on a sample of a crying baby, recorded over a shuffling rhythm that some music historians have described as the first dancehall record, in which he publicly called out his former employer in terms that could not be mistaken. He was calling Coxsone a thief. He said it in music because that was the language available to him, and the language he was best at. What exactly Coxsone had taken, beyond the general pattern of underpayment, was never fully articulated by Perry in any single account. The specifics of what happened in the months before his departure, what was said, what was not said, what was discovered, Perry kept inside the music rather than in any statement. The 1970s brought a different Studio One. The Skatalites were gone. The Wailers were signed to Island Records and on their way to a global audience that Coxsone had never thought to pursue. Lee Scratch Perry was operating the Black Ark studio out of his own yard and building a sound that would become its own legend. Coxsone was still at Brentford Road, still recording, still building the catalog, still operating on the same financial model he had always used. New artists arrived. Burning Spear, who came down from St. Anne and stood in the Studio One booth and sang his Garveyite consciousness reggae with an intensity that made even Coxsone's hardened ears take notice. Dennis Brown, who was 17 years old when he recorded at Brentford Road, and whose voice was so fully formed that it did not seem to belong to a teenager at all. Freddie McGregor, Cornell Campbell, Sugar Monot, who came in and recorded prolifically, and was paid by his own later account almost nothing for work that would later sell internationally for decades. The question of what Studio One's catalog was worth and who that value belonged to would shadow Coxsone for the rest of his life. He never apologized for the payment structure he operated under. He never acknowledged, in public, that the artists who made his catalog had been systematically denied the royalties their music earned. His position, stated when he chose to speak about it at all, was that he had found talent nobody else was nurturing, had built a studio nobody else had built, had created an industry from nothing, and that the terms offered were the terms available in the Jamaica of the 1960s. His critics, and there were many, including nearly every significant artist who had ever recorded at Brentford Road, said that acknowledging an industry's brutality was not the same as being innocent of it. The violence that ended Studio One's Kingston operations came not from the legal system or from artists demanding redress, but from the political warfare that consumed the city in the late 1970s. The garrison neighborhoods of Kingston, West Kingston in particular, where political allegiance was enforced with guns, and the consequences of being on the wrong side were final, had grown so dangerous that operating a studio, employing staff, and maintaining a commercial premises required levels of political protection that Coxsone either could not or would not maintain. By the early 1980s, he had effectively relocated to New York City, to Brooklyn, where the Jamaican diaspora had built its own version of Kingston's musical culture, and he continued to operate Studio One from there. He licensed the catalog, re-released recordings, and made the intellectual property that he owned work commercially in international markets that the artists who created it had rarely been able to access. By the time the world music market discovered the Studio One catalog in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, as samplers and DJs working in hip-hop, drum and bass, UK garage, and eventually Afrobeats began mining its rhythms for raw material. The scale of what Coxsone had built was fully apparent. There was no single more important archive of recorded Jamaican music. The Brentford Road sessions had produced more of the foundational vocabulary of not just reggae, but contemporary black diasporic music globally than any other single location on earth. Producers who had never been to Jamaica were building careers on records that Coxsone had made in 1964 and 1967 and 1970, and the artists who made those records were watching from a distance while others profited. Lee Perry, for his part, continued to speak about Coxsone in the years following his departure. His accounts were never consistent. Perry was not a man who gave consistent accounts of anything, but the emotional core of what he said remained constant across decades, that something had been taken from him that went beyond money, that what happened at Brentford Road had involved a kind of theft that the payment of session fees could not cover. He never named a specific event. The songs were as specific as he got, and by the time anyone thought to ask him the direct question in a way that might have produced a definitive answer, Perry was operating in the register of myth and symbol that made direct questions feel slightly beside the point. What was stolen? When? How? What Coxsone knew about what was taken? None of it ever received a final accounting. Clement Seymour, Sir Coxsone and Dodd, died on May 4th, 2004, in Brooklyn, New York. He was 72 years old. He had spent the last years of his life continuing to issue material from the Studio One vault, continuing to operate on his own terms, continuing to be, in the eyes of the Jamaican music industry, simultaneously its most foundational architect and its most morally ambiguous figure. The tributes that came in from around the world were genuine and extensive. Bob Marley was gone by then. Peter Tosh had been murdered in 1987. Bunny Livingston spoke carefully. Scratch Perry, who was still very much alive and still recording, and still capable of saying extraordinary things in extraordinary ways, gave an account of Dodd's death that managed to be simultaneously a tribute and a continued argument, the argument that had never been settled, that Coxsone had taken to his grave, along with whatever he had taken from all those Brentford Road sessions that the artists never got back. The Studio One catalog is maintained by his family. The rhythms keep circulating. Real rock has been voiced over by hundreds of artists in the 6 decades since Jackie Mittoo played it in that small room on Brentford Road. The Wailers recordings from 1963 to 1966, those ska-era sessions that Coxsone owned, that Bob Marley could not buy back, that have been reissued and licensed and sampled and studied by producers in London and Lagos and Atlanta and Tokyo, sit in the catalog, alongside recordings by people whose names most of those producers have never heard. All of it came from that one man's decision to build a studio, trust his ear, and refuse to let anyone else control the source. The question that hangs over the full story of Clement Dodd, the one that no tribute or obituary has adequately answered, the one that Lee Perry's music asked and that the artists who passed through Brentford Road asked in interviews and in their own music and in their silence, is not whether he was a genius. He was a genius. The question is, what a genius owes the people whose talent made the genius visible. And on that question, the archive is complete. The answer is not.